Well, hello and welcome to another edition of In the Trenches podcast. I'm your host, Seth Root, and with me is a very special guest. He is part of the AIER, which what does it stand for?
The American Institute for Economic Research.
Right, he has written many books. His recent book is actually on the 1619 Project, which you can get in probably on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and other such places. And his name is Phil Magness, and the reason why I have him on today is because he has done a lot of good work when it comes to not just the 1619 Project, but also done a lot of investigative, I think, work on Nancy MacLean's book called The Democracy and Change, The Deep History of Radical Right Stealth Plan for America, and also her other scholarly work when it comes to the school choice issue. And so I thought I'd bring him in to give a little bit of the audience a little bit into what's going on and why this is so important. So, Mr. Magness, thank you so much for coming on our show.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So, I thought before we get into Nancy MacLean's book and the hit pieces she has written on various economic thinkers, I thought we should talk a little bit about the people who she's talking about. So, James Buchanan and Milton Friedman. So, to start off, I want us to start with Buchanan and his contributions and all that. So, can you give us just a little background into him?
Yeah, so James Buchanan was a mid to late 20th century American economist who's best known as one of the co-founders of the public choice subfield in economics. And what public choice is, it's essentially taking economic reasoning and tools and analysis and using them, applying them to the study of politics and the study of governance. Another way of putting it, and Buchanan would often refer to it as this way, is looking at politics without the romance, politics without the idealized version of what our governing system could deliver, and actually asking what do the institutions we have in place with the politicians that we know and the incentives that they face, what type of processes and outcomes are yielded by that. So he really revolutionizes the way that economists look at political institutions and mechanisms. He's most noted for his study of constitutional economics. So he's asking questions like what happens under different rulemaking regimes, a bicameral legislature, for example, or a certain vote rule or a threshold. So do you need a 2/3 majority in a legislative body to overrule a veto? Do you need different layers of the legislative process? How do they yield outcomes? And what are those outcomes going to result in terms of the policies that are made for society? So he founds this discipline, co-founds this discipline really in the 1960s at the University of Virginia. And in recognition of it, he's awarded the Nobel Prize in economics in 1985 after he's moved to George Mason University and really becomes kind of the elder statesman of the public choice discipline. Passed away in 2013 and was really regarded as one of the top figures in the field at the time that he died. And then Nancy MacLean came along and decided she was going to write a very strange conspiratorial screed about him.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned a little bit about public choice theory. Now, I have my beefs with public choice theory, but I believe it's very like a lot of people know it in the academic circles. There's nothing really nefarious, in with public choice theory, correct?
Right. I mean, it's using economic tools and reasoning to understand governance. And part of it is drawn from something that is essential and crucial to public policy making and political science as the Madisonian theory of our Constitution that's laid out in the Federalist Papers. In fact, Buchanan draws very heavily on Madisonian constitutional mechanisms, and he's asking the question, how do they work? How do they operate in a formalized constitutional framework of rules that are set up? So it's another way of systematizing and formalizing what has been set forth in political theory for multiple generations, and really cuts to the core of the American system of governance.
So I have a question because, uh, my interpretation or um my feeling about James Buchanan is he's very much an academic, and very much a nerd,
Yes.
who really was just all about, the theory of public choice and how that relates to government. And so I find it strange that Nancy MacLean would make James Buchanan this boogeyman.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you had a theory or such, or why she thinks Buchanan is the guy that starts, this big radical right wing conspiracy.
Right. Yeah, he is a very odd choice for someone to pick as a boogeyman, and yet that's what she does. What I would note is she is going after him. I think a large part of it is motivated by the fact that he is a very influential and credible figure in the economics discipline. I mean, it's tearing down a Nobel Prize winner is no small feat. So he has a big target on his back for that reason alone. But what I note, and this came out of my own research, both in reading MacLean's book and then digging deeper into Buchanan's own work, discovered Nancy MacLean basically had her theory, and I'll outright call it a conspiracy theory. That's what it is. It's a conspiracy theory dressed up in academic garb. She had it all mapped out in a paper, a working paper that she put out, I think it was around 2007, 2008, before she had ever even heard the name James M. Buchanan. And it lays out this notion that the political right is trying to subvert democracy through all these institutions and rules. And she just did not have a boogeyman figure to attach to that yet. Through happenstance, and as I later discovered in doing research on this topic, she stumbled across Buchanan's name in an article or a book chapter by another historian by the name of James Hirschman. And Hirschman had been working on the desegregation movement in Virginia in the 1950s and 60s. And in this paper by Hirschman, he mistakenly attributed an article by Buchanan and a co-author, Warren Nutter, who also plays into the story, to an erroneous source. He placed it in the wrong newspaper. So there was a typo error that this guy had made in one of his footnotes. MacLean reads this typo, discovers Buchanan is, so what Hirschman had done is he had incorrectly assigned him and associated him with the segregationists by mistaking the newspapers in which he was publishing. MacLean reads that and concludes, aha, there's my boogeyman, and decides to just narrow in on him and make her, she basically turns him into the villain of her narrative of how she thinks the radical right is trying to subvert democracy.
Yeah, that is because it really was strange to me that she will make this guy the boogeyman, and no offense to economists and such, but it was just one of those things where I was like, okay, this guy who, like you said, is very well respected in academic circles, is nonetheless, a academic,
Yeah.
so I found it hard to believe that this guy was sort of the, segregationist, racist that she seems to paint him.
Yeah.
Um, and yet it's been getting, I would say, she's been getting a lot of love from mainstream media somewhat. So I would like you, if you could, just go back. I know you mentioned that she misinterpreted this guy's essay about segregation in in Virginia. But what other things did she mistaken? What was she mistaken about James Buchanan and the right largely? You
Yeah,
know,
well, I'd say the core of her narrative, as I've said, it's a conspiracy theory that tries to identify this one academic, a fairly obscure academic for her world, someone she had never encountered before, and she's trying to blame him for all the grievances that she has with political outcomes in 2021 America. She was looking for a theory that explained why progressive left politics that she adheres to find opposition in our current political system, and she retrofitted him into that. Some of the major errors, and this is where I first encountered the book, is when it came out in 2017. I was obviously interested in it, even though I knew it was going to be a hostile take because I'd worked on Buchanan's theories before. I knew Buchanan, briefly interacted with him. He was very old at the time, but when I was going through grad school, met him a couple times, talked to him. And it really struck me just opening this book that she had painted someone that I thought of as a very kind and academically serious thinker, scholar, someone who rightly had a lot of acclaim behind his work, and she's painting him as this horrendous manipulative monster. And the first thing that jumped out to me as an error is she declares in the opening introduction to her book that Buchanan is the intellectual heir of John C. Calhoun, the Southern Vice President of the United States, the champion of nullification theory, and the positive good view of slavery before the American Civil War. So Calhoun's a very complex, politically sophisticated thinker, but he's an arch pro-slavery thinker. And she declares in the book that Calhoun was James M. Buchanan's intellectual lodestar. Uses that exact language. He's an intellectual lodestar. And I'm sitting here reading. I've known and worked with Buchanan's academic corpus for better part of 2 decades now, and have read dozens of articles and books that he's done. And I had never once encountered the name John C. Calhoun in any of them. It's simply not there. It's not in any of the indexes. It's not in any of the references. I'm sitting thinking, here's this lady that's calling Calhoun Buchanan's intellectual lodestar and like the secret backdrop of his entire theory of government. And yet Buchanan never even references him. Something was wrong there. I start digging a little bit deeper into it, and I discovered, in fact, a question had been posed to Buchanan and his co-author Gordon Tullock in 1974 or thereabouts, the American Political Science Review, so no small journal. Another author had written about theories of constitutional governance, of which Calhoun, as is James Madison, as is John Locke, as are all the major figures we study in political science. They fit into a corpus of different theories of how governance can be structured at the constitutional level. And this author had queried whether Buchanan had drawn any of his ideas out of Calhoun, because there are some similarities, some differences, but nonetheless, they're operating in the same kind of Madisonian orbit. So it's not a big surprise they talk about the same issues. But this author queried in the American Political Science Review, top journal in the profession, and Gordon Tullock, Buchanan's co-author, writes him back and writes a response to it and says that I, for the life of me, have never read John C. Calhoun and have always found his theories uninteresting. And I'm certain that my co-author, James M. Buchanan, has the same opinion of them. So not only do we have an absence of Calhoun in Buchanan's own work, we have an express repudiation of Calhoun from Buchanan's main co-author and main co-theorist in the founding of the public choice discipline. So Nancy MacLean is just making this up out of whole cloth and running with it. And it's not only false speculation, it's something that's contradicted in fact.
in college, this is my recollection of what writing is supposed to be. You're supposed to back everything up with, citations,
Yeah.
all of that stuff. So was there a breakdown in the process of her writing this book? Like, how did this book get into publication without I mean, even
Yeah.
from what you say, cursory look at James Buchanan's work. I mean, you know, what happened? I guess is what I'm asking.
Here's the thing, and this was pointed out very early on after it came out in print. People started noticing problems with it. I wasn't the only one. Others started finding errors, basic, simple errors of fact, misquotations. There was even a couple of cases where Nancy MacLean herself edited and changed the wording and ordering of certain quotations to make them sound different than what they were. So really egregious stuff that ventures into the territory of academic misconduct. And yet it slipped through into this book without any notice. And people started raising questions, said, how did such a shoddy work get into print on a major press? And not only that, attain all sorts of academic acclaim. And MacLean actually responds, and this is why I say it's fair to call this a conspiracy theory. She responds, she said, well, I didn't show my book manuscript to anyone in the public choice world, any scholars of Buchanan, because I didn't want to tip them off that I was on to them. I mean, this is crazy talk. This is someone who had an academic mission to attack Buchanan, attack something that she disliked, and do so for political reasons. And yet she had convinced herself that rather than engaging in a scholarly dialogue, even if it's a critical dialogue, she convinced herself that she was exposing a conspiracy, that she was exposing the evil that was at the root of everything that she dislikes about American politics today, and therefore had to keep the cards close to her chest, or else people would have caught on to her and I don't know, done something to stop the publication of the book, I guess is what she thought she was avoiding there. But it speaks to someone who's really not of a sound scholarly mind, someone who's convinced herself to venture deep into conspiracy theory territory and then write a quasi biography of the figure she thinks is at the center of the conspiracy. That's not a good scholarly approach. It's not something that ever ends well, because you've already got your story before you even look at the evidence. And that causes you to distort the way that you present evidence, which is what we find throughout her book.
Well, one of the things that I mean, even if you, I mean, I was surprised at some of the things that she mentioned in her book that didn't, that I mean, that her editors didn't catch or anything. For instance, I believe in her book she also got wrong the year the Federalist Society was founded.
Right.
Like some of this stuff, even if you're not, I don't know, big into, I mean, like you don't know that world, like some of this stuff is Googleable,
Right. Right.
so like some of this, I, I, let's say just for the sake of argument, concede that, she won't give her book manuscript to, public choice theorists and stuff. But this other like basic stuff, like when the Federalist Society was founded, I would assume that that is something like, okay, let's make sure this is correct, like this
Yeah.
date and stuff is correct. And she didn't do that. I mean,
Uh, It's,
it's
it's
weird.
the scholarly diligence that one would expect from someone at an elite university, from a tenured full professor at Duke University, was completely missing from this book. To add even greater oddities to the whole story here, this book was publicly subsidized by the taxpayer. She had a very large National Endowment for the Humanities grant to fund her to write this book, to write this political polemic. So in a sense, you want to ask where this book came about from. It's because the government, using our tax dollars, paid her to write a political hatchet job. That tells me there was a breakdown in the National Endowment for the Humanities entire process, that they rubber stamped this thing, that they let it slide through with what should have been a rigorous peer review process. But instead, because they agreed with the political message that she was promoting, as did many other academics, they've allowed the errors to slide. They've overlooked the sloppiness throughout the book. They have basically set aside what should be concerns for an academic scandal and said, well, maybe she erred in a couple places, but we agree with her narrative. We agree with her political argument.
Yeah, I mean that's an important point you make about, the academic community, just the breakdown of it, and how they have uh, right, help perpetuate this sort of conspiracy theory to go out into, a lot of, colleges today. Like I said, in the green room with you, the college that I went to in this, the government class that partook of. We listened to Nancy MacLean talk about her book, and so it's disappointing to see that a lot of the academic community didn't um, scrutinize the book
Right.
as it should have. Um, but I do say this, that I think both sides, I think you would agree, have done the conspiracy sort of
Yeah.
thing, and say, this is where things got off the rails, and create some kind of boogeyman and conspiracy and such. But what makes it different is that it's not just that she wrote a book about this one man. Now she's going and centering her, attacking another person, Milton Freeman, who I think maybe some people know in our, because he's written, Free to Choose and some of the other great books that he has written in the past. But I was wondering if you can tell us who Milton Freeman, and then we should go into what she's saying about him. So
Yeah.
first, tell us about him.
Yeah, Milton Friedman is another very prominent economist. Again, wrote roughly contemporaneously to Buchanan himself. He was considered probably one of the main intellectual lights of what we refer to as the Chicago School of Economic Thought. This is a free market, price theory centric approach to understanding economic activity, economic events. He was a public intellectual in addition to being a very widely cited, respected scholar because he wrote newspaper columns for Newsweek, had a television series called Free to Choose, wrote several popular books and works that basically became bestsellers. So he's a public intellectual, free market economist that also has academic heft behind him. He won the Nobel Prize as well for his work in monetary policy. But one of the things about Friedman is, well before Nancy MacLean, he too kind of became the boogeyman for the progressive left. And I really mean the far progressive left. People who think that capitalism is evil and that Friedman is the centerpiece architect of something that's referred to in some of the literature. They call it disaster capitalism. Some of your listeners may have heard of another author by the name of Naomi Klein. She wrote this like crazy screed attacking Milton Friedman in a very similar way to what Buchanan uh, serves for Nancy MacLean as the bete noir of all things that Naomi Klein thought was wrong and with the world. And that basically comes down to free market capitalism. And she says this leads to environmental destruction, inequality, poverty, and therefore you need the government to step in and counteract it. So Friedman's reputation has been battered for many decades by people on the other side, by the progressive left. But I think that's a testament also to him being a very well-known and widely regarded and acclaimed public intellectual who was making strong arguments in favor of the free market system.
Now, just for my clarification, what was Milton Freeman ever influenced by Buchanan's work and thought? Just curious, because
Yeah,
maybe
so
this is where she's
so
getting some of this
Friedman,
from.
Friedman, a very young professor at the University of Chicago, Buchanan was one of the students that came through there.
Okay.
Buchanan studied at Chicago. They weren't that much different, that much far apart in age. So this is early in Friedman's career in like the 1940s. So Buchanan, I think, graduated in 1949. His other colleague at the University of Virginia, Warren Nutter, was Milton Friedman's first doctoral student that came out of Chicago as well. So Buchanan and Nutter were classmates who also both went on to the University of Virginia, and both of them had ties to Friedman. They weren't exactly aligned on every single policy issue. You know, Buchanan focuses more on constitutional economics, public choice, whereas Friedman is a monetary economist first and foremost. So they work on different areas, but they're in the same philosophical orbit. They both draw heavily on price theory. They both come out of a common intellectual tradition.
Okay, got it. So, in her essay or article, which I believe was, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, it seems like this essay or article was printed in a European press or art or
Right,
academic
right.
sphere. It wasn't in the U.S. from what I've seen, because I read a little bit of it, but it made some noise anyway. And she's attacking Friedman, of course, calling him a racist,
Yeah.
for supporting school choice.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
so I was wondering first if you can, because you've written about it in the Wall Street Journal,
Yep.
about the history of school choice, and then I want to ask you what sort of things has she mischaracterized Friedman's position and such.
Yeah, yeah. So this is a key thing. So Friedman wrote an article in 1955 that is considered kind of the classic economic articulation of school voucher theory. It's not the original articulation of school voucher theory. For that, we got to go all the way back to Adam Smith and The Wealth of Nations. He actually lays out the precursors to a competitive schooling system. Smith, by the way, is an abolitionist, so if you want to bring the slavery issue there, it doesn't really jive with the notion that this is a racist policy by background. There were other writers that developed school choice theory. Thomas Paine, who we know more so for the American Revolution, actually wrote an essay that basically lays out a theory for school choice. In the 19th century, John Stuart Mill, who was another abolitionist economist in the British Empire, writes a theory of school choice. There are school choice programs that are put into place in New England in the late 19th century. But 1955, Friedman writes a formal economic articulation of what school choice means and what competition between institutions of education could do to bring about an improvement in the quality of the product that's offered by education. So it's solving the perpetual problem of failing schools. He published it in 1955, although the manuscript had been submitted about a year and a half or so before that, which is key and important in understanding our dates, because what MacLean is saying is that Friedman's argument fueled the segregationist backlash to Brown versus Board of Education, the desegregation case that was handed down in 1954. Um, it was just a matter of almost pure coincidence that Friedman had been working on the school choice article when Brown versus Board was decided. And I've actually been into the archives and found the letters because the case was handed down, and one of the co-editors of the volume writes Friedman and says, this new Court case was just decided on school desegregation. Can you respond to this in your article? Because it's on an issue of schooling. And Friedman responds and says, okay, well, I can add a footnote to the article. And it was more like a multi-paragraph footnote where he discusses his theory and its implications in light of the desegregation decision. What MacLean does is she says that basically because Friedman was arguing for school vouchers in 1955, that this provided ammunition to the segregationists who were looking for other ways to sidestep the desegregation of schools that had been ordered by the federal courts. In other words, move children out of public schools that are facing integration and into private segregated schools, and do so with a voucher. Thereby you sidestep Brown versus Board of Education. That's her argument, and that's her view of what she thinks Friedman is up to. Yet if you actually read Friedman's work and papers, he comes down unambiguously in opposition to segregation. He describes himself as an integrationist. He says that that's not the object at all. And he says when he's considering his theory of school choice, he's asking the question, will this program that I'm proposing, a school voucher system, aid or undermine segregation? And he walks through the theory step by step. And he comes to the ultimate conclusion. He says that vouchers will undermine segregation, not aid it, because properly administered and properly designed, a school voucher system allows movement between schools. Well, what happens if you have students that exit one school to go to another? What happens if you have the segregationist agitators in one school decide, hey, they're going to take all their children and leave? Well, that removes some of the voice of the equation that was pushing to maintain segregation. And he argues that eventually, over time, the integrationists win out through economic processes over the segregationists as long as you allow this movement to occur, allow the sorting to occur. And his whole entire premise here is to use the school voucher system as a mechanism to break down and undermine segregation where it's been politically supported by the state.
So again, it seems like she never really carefully looked at Milton Friedman's work, to ascertain whether he was a segregationist or not, correct?
No, she went in with a preconceived notion that vouchers necessarily support segregation. This has been a major talking point put forth by a lot of the teachers union interests. So like Randy Weingarten has argued it in the past several years. Some other figures in that world have said they want to try and discredit school vouchers by linking them to segregation. And they've got this historical falsehood of a story that says that voucher advocates were working hand in hand with the segregationists because they thought this was an opportunity to force school vouchers through by getting segregationists to support it. If you actually look at the evidence, though, behind this theory, it's a complete oversimplification and misstating of the actual history. The ground zero for this, and this is where both Friedman and Buchanan come into the story, because Buchanan's at the University of Virginia, is the state of Virginia. So after Brown versus Board is handed down, so 2 years later, the political machine in Virginia was very oriented towards segregation. This is Senator Harry Flood Byrd Sr. was considered kind of the leader of that operation. But the segregationist political institutions in the state, what they declared they were going to do was massive resistance. They executed a plan they called massive resistance. And this was basically a mandate. They tried to use the state laws in Virginia to defy the federal courts. They said, you've handed down Brown versus Board of Education. You said we have to desegregate, but we're not going to do it. We're going to defy you by throwing up administrative obstacles. And the first thing they did was that they passed a law that said any public school system under an integration order in Virginia will be shuttered, and its students will be automatically transferred to private institutions, private academies that were subsidized by the state. Well, MacLean sees that and says, aha, well, private institutions being subsidized by the state, that's vouchers. Therefore, Milton Friedman and James Buchanan were supportive of this. That's not really the case at all. That's not the type of program that either Buchanan or Friedman were advocating. In fact, they explicitly opposed that in several of their writings, that type of a mentality. What actually ends up happening is the federal courts come back and they strike down Virginia's massive resistance laws. They declare them unconstitutional, and they said that any school district that persists in this will be in contempt of federal court. So there was they were on the eve of basically a constitutional showdown. This is occurring in 1959 when one of the major decisions is made against the massive resistance movement that throws the state's political system into chaos. And what happens in that chaos is the segregationist hardliners start to lose the public support. They start to lose the support of not only integrationists, people that were already opposed to them, but even some of the more moderate voices that lean towards segregation, but we're now starting to come around and say, wait a minute, Brown versus Board is now inevitable. We aren't going to win this one. We need to figure out how to move forward and implement the case. So there's all sorts of political factions that are fracturing. And what happens in 1959 is that some of the moderates that bolt from the massive resistors and start to accept the reality of Brown versus Board, they called themselves the cushioner movements. They wanted to cushion or soften the landing of Brown versus Board, knowing it was now inevitable in Virginia. They bolted from the segregationist massive resistors, the hardliners who still wanted to defy the federal courts, and they actually struck a very unusual political alliance with the moderate business class of Virginia and actually some of the integrationists, the people that had supported Brown versus Board in the Virginia Assembly. And their solution to outmaneuver, outflank, and break massive resistance in Virginia was that they adopted the essential building blocks of a school voucher system. They called it a tuition grant system. And to abide by the federal courts, both the integrationist and then the moderate segregationists that were bolting from the massive resistors struck an agreement that this was going to be a race-neutral institution that was offered to any student. And the integrationists, they view this, they say, obviously, if we offer school vouchers, this allows people to move from segregated to integrated schools. The moderate segregationists see it the other way. They say, okay, we allow school vouchers. People that are opposed to integration will pull their children out of those schools and move them to segregated private schools or some alternative system. But the recognition here is that by introducing school choice into the mix, they undermined this one-size-fits-all hardline segregationist approach that the massive resistors had been arguing for. And then you have the theorists like Friedman and Buchanan are seeing this, and they're saying, well, if we allow a school voucher system to operate and we use the moral suasion that segregation is wrong, we try to convince people and use the market as our mechanism to convince people that segregation is wrong, segregation will lose over time. Segregation will be phased out as people abandon it. People leave schools and abandon it. And Friedman predicts in the late 50s and early 60s, he says, if you have a school voucher system in place and you implement it in a segregated state, it will precipitate a movement from the segregationist schools to integrated schools over time, thereby basically causing the institution of segregation to crumble away. Causing it to crumble away no matter what the segregationists tried to do in terms of policy. And this is where things get really interesting in Virginia, is because not only does Friedman recognize vouchers as a way to attack segregation, the segregationist hardliners themselves recognized the same problem from their perspective. They said, if we pass a school voucher program, this is going to mean students leave our schools. Students leave the segregated schools for integrated schools. And when they do so, it undermines our other mechanisms that they were trying to maintain in place to keep segregation in line. So what happens in early 1959, there's a very prominent attorney in Virginia by the name of John S. Battle Jr. He's a member of the elite political class in Virginia, the son of a former governor. He's also the chief litigator of the segregationists in all of their lawsuit battles with the NAACP to integrate Virginia schools. And he recognizes, he says, if tuition grants come to fruition, if they pass, if they're adopted, anytime a parent in an all-white school moves to another school, that opens up a new seat in the classroom. And because of Brown versus Board, we're now powerless to stop a Black student from taking that seat. Therefore, integration happens by default. This is what Friedman had predicted would happen. But Battle, this arch segregationist, is seeing it from the other side, and he's horrified. So he issues basically a plan to the state. He says, in order to maintain segregation, we have to cap enrollment in all the white schools, and we have to make sure that every seat is filled there, and then we can deny Black transfer applicants a chance to move into the all-white schools, because we can say the classrooms are full, there's no space for them. Or maybe they live in the wrong geography. They can't come across district lines. They're not zoned to that school. So he has an elaborate plan to maintain segregation even after segregation is illegal per the US Supreme Court. But he says the Achilles heel of this plan is this tuition grant or voucher system, because as soon as people start using tuition grants and vouchers, they can move between schools, they can cross geographic zones, and that opens up seats in classrooms that now can be filled by Black students. So Battle issues a proclamation at a PTA meeting in March of 1959 in one of the schools that was facing an integration order. He says, if we allow the tuition grants to operate as intended, seats will open up in our classrooms, and our all-white elementary school will be, quote, engulfed by the Negroes. So horrendously racist language. And what does Battle do? Well, he immediately finds an audience in the schools, teachers unions, the Virginia Education Association, the NEA's chapter for the state, they embrace his argument. They say, well, we oppose vouchers too for all the reasons that teachers unions oppose vouchers today. They thought they were going to take away school finances, but we can team up with the segregationists here and defeat this program. So they wage basically a 6-year legislative campaign to repeal the voucher system in Virginia on explicitly segregationist grounds. That's what's missing from Nancy MacLean's story, and it completely upends her narrative.
Yeah, it's a big part of the story. It feels like, I'm going to get to school choice today, but really, I would like to know, because you talked a little bit about the historical evidence of school choice and stuff, but
Yeah,
what about the empirical evidence and academic study that tell us about the effect of school choice on integration and
absolutely.
racial diversity in schools?
So this has been a huge area of study for economists and political scientists in more recent times, because now we actually have some operating school voucher programs spread around the country. Some of them are local, some of them are at the state level, but there's enough data, enough evidence to see what is the actual effect of school vouchers on racial diversity in these institutions. And I say not only vouchers, but you also can expand that to school choice in general. So the creation of charter schools also falls into that and has some evidence behind it. And of all the empirical studies that have been done on it, and I think there are running lists that are maintained by some of the major voucher groups. Almost every study has found that at minimum, school choice increases the diversity of schooling institutions, both public and private, from where they were before school choice was introduced. And the weakest of those studies, at worst, it finds that there's no effect, and several of them find that there's a very positive effect of increasing racial and ethnic and religious diversity in various institutions of schooling once you allow people to have that choice, which makes sense. It also explains why there's actually a divide on the political left among some of the major constituencies of the Democratic Party. If you poll people who traditionally vote Democratic, African Americans and Hispanic Americans that vote Democratic, a majority of them typically support school vouchers. It's actually very popular. They know, they've experienced this on the ground. This is a way to get out of failing schools and move their children into areas where they can actually get a better education. So they view vouchers very favorably in Black and Hispanic communities, including constituencies that vote overwhelmingly Democratic. Yet if you ask white Democrats, they're opposed to school vouchers. So the survey shows a clear divide on racial lines and ethnic lines between white Democrats and racial and ethnic minority Democrats over whether school vouchers should be permitted. And this has caused something of a crisis on the political left, including the constituencies of the Democratic Party that are tied to the teachers unions, which do tend to be overwhelmingly oriented to the white community, and they're basically neglecting or even impeding a desired policy outcome that African American and Hispanic Democrats find very popular.
So that brings me to today, in which it seems like, as you mentioned earlier, that the teachers' unions and Nancy MacLean and some of their people want to make, school choice look like this part of the idea is, I don't know how else to put it, but like systemically racist, been
Yes,
always
yeah,
racist from the beginning, kind of using the 1619 project framework.
yeah.
Um, and so my last question to you is, what could we do to push that back and talk really about the truth of the matter when it comes to school choice?
Yeah.
Because the outcomes, it seems like, is different from what they're saying.
That's exactly it. So you have two fronts on the evidentiary approaches. The first is to combat this historical myth that they've created, this claim that school choice was wedded at the hip to segregation in the 50s. The only reason they're promoting this myth is because they view it as something that could be discrediting to school choice today. So going back and investigating that history, what you actually find that's happening in the 1950s and 60s is that most school choice proponents, the Milton Friedmans of the world, and there are several organizations. One I like to point to because it's the biggest school voucher group in America, was called Citizens for Educational Freedom. It was founded in the late 50s and was very active in the 50s and 60s. It's actually it's a Catholic organization. So it's associated with several Catholic priests and Catholic cultural organizations. They wanted school choice because historically, religious schools had been excluded from the public schooling system. This goes back to the 19th century when there were discriminatory laws passed against religious schools versus secular public schools. So there was another angle in there of religious discrimination that school choice was trying to overcome. Another racial dimension, and this is very prominent in Citizens for Educational Freedom's literature in the 50s and 60s, is a lot of the Catholic schools started admitting African American students before the public school system. So they integrated earlier than the public school system. And they viewed vouchers as a mechanism to aid in that. Well, what does CEF do? In 1964, there's a major Supreme Court case in the state of Virginia against Prince Edward County, which was one of these holdouts that adhered to massive resistance, shuttered its public school system, and they were trying to access voucher money. Well, the legal case is a federal judge prohibited Prince Edward County from accessing voucher money on the grounds that they were violating basically civil rights. They were denying access to education to African Americans. Therefore, they were ineligible for voucher money. And this made it to the Supreme Court. Well, what does CEF do? They write an amicus brief on behalf of the African American students. So the pro-voucher group is so committed to ending segregation, to fighting segregation, that they actually side with the African American students against the segregationists that were trying to overcome a federal injunction on receiving voucher money as long as segregation remained. This is a really complex case, but what you find is back in the 50s and 60s, most of the voucher advocates are morally, ethically, and politically opposed to segregation. That's an important story to tell because it counters the falsehood, these simplified narratives that are really created for political reasons by people like Randy Weingarten and Nancy MacLean. The other half of the story is we need to highlight and draw attention to the empirical evidence of what's going on where vouchers are used and show that it is, in fact, very popular among racial minorities, ethnic minorities, that the best evidence we have of vouchers in action show that the main beneficiaries of these programs, these schools, are people in the inner city that tend to come from historically marginalized groups, economically disadvantaged groups that are simply trying to escape a failing public school system. The other part of that story is to recognize is that what happened in the public school system in the 1950s and 60s after Brown versus Board of Education in the South was not pretty. It wasn't like Brown versus Board was handed down and all of the public school systems suddenly decided, okay, we're going to comply with it. What they did is they shifted tactics. And I have drawn attention to this in some of my own work, pointing to the case of Arlington County, Virginia, which is famously among the more liberal-leaning areas of the state of Virginia. It's just outside of Washington, D.C. And what happened after Brown versus Board is Arlington is normally presented as like the exception in the South that went along and agreed to abide by the decision. It turns out that's not true at all. What they did is they committed to desegregate on paper and then immediately turned to all these administrative obstacles to prevent African American students from transferring schools in practice. And they'd say things like, well, we'd like to allow you to transfer a school, but there isn't space in this school. Or you live in the wrong neighborhood to be able to transfer to a white school. And they actually even adopted some policies. They were trying to impose these fabricated IQ tests and intelligence tests and claiming that African-American students weren't smart enough to succeed in the white schools and therefore they couldn't transfer. It all turns out to be a flimsy racist nonsense, but they were trying other ways to maintain segregation without officially calling it segregation. And this persisted for almost 2 decades after Brown versus Board of Education. So the approach that someone like Nancy MacLean would champion and say is the right way to do it, and say that the rest of the country should have followed, is wedded to the school interest. It turns out that's the thing that was actually preserving segregation. It's the public school system that rejected vouchers, that refused and fought against vouchers, was the one that ended up being the most wedded to maintaining and extending and preserving segregation, if not under law, as a reality, as a fact, a de facto segregation done on administrative grounds. And you ask the question, well, what is that? That's the very definition of systemic racism. It's the law says that we can no longer formally segregate under statute. So instead, we adopt policies that bring about de facto segregation, in effect, by making it nearly impossible for African American students to transfer to a white majority school. So that's the story we need to be telling. That's the story that actually corrects the course on the history that some of these authors are manipulating and trying to enlist in their anti-voucher arguments today, because it really does reveal not only the sordid history of the public school interest and the way they approach this, it also reveals exactly why vouchers were a threat to the status quo.
Well, Mr. Magness, it's been a pleasure to have you on my show and talk about these things. I know, to some of our people, may be new to them, this sort of attack by the left, so to speak, the teachers unions, Nancy MacLean and stuff, and maybe you haven't heard all this, but it's definitely in our universities,
Yes.
and it's um and these teacher unions are promoting it, which is why I wanted to focus on that today. And hopefully, with this kind of knowledge, we can all kind of push back against this, because, um, I mean, school choice is important in my view.
Absolutely.
It's something that well, I was homeschooled, so for me, it was great to be homeschooled, but not many people have that opportunity. So um trying to the next best thing, I think, is school choice. So being part of a charter school or whatever, and letting the parent do whatever is best in the best interest of the child here, and I think
Yeah.
that's important. So again, Mr. Magness, thank you so much for being on.
Absolutely.
All right, well, signing off from the trenches.